Do you know what forced labor is? You may have an idea, but the truth is, it's harder to define and identify than you might imagine. Cases can involve deception and manipulation, in addition to physical violence or its threat, all of which can be hard to see and even harder to prove. Unfortunately, forced labor is a real problem in many regions of the world today, affecting many agricultural sectors, including those in Sub-Saharan Africa. In cocoa, while it has been documented to be quite rare and localized, it is still a potential risk that needs to be addressed. By understanding what forced labor is, how to identify it, and what the underlying risk factors are, we can identify solutions for victims or those at risk and help prevent it from happening in the first place. So, what is forced labor? Forced labor is defined as work that is done involuntarily and under the threat or menace of any penalty. In other words, doing work you did not originally agree to in the face of some kind of threat or abuse. But it isn't always easy to tell when this is the case. So, in practice, we look for signs. Signs of whether a worker is doing something they did not agree to do voluntarily, and whether they are doing it because they're being threatened with some kind of penalty. These signs include things like workers performing tasks they weren't originally hired for, or working for longer than was originally agreed, or in dangerous conditions to which the worker did not consent, often without protective equipment. Penalties that might be applied or threatened include deducting wages for reasons not discussed during the recruitment, identity papers withheld by recruiters or the employer, or physical violence or other forms of abuse against the worker or their family. When found together, these two components are what define forced labor. For children, forced labor is defined as working because of a penalty, or threat of one, from someone other than the parent. This could be a threat to the child or the parent. At times, children are forced to work because their parents themselves are in forced labor. What are the risk factors of forced labor? Illiteracy, linked to a lack of access to quality education, means workers often struggle to understand their rights or employment contracts. Traditional patterns of migration often uproot workers from the societies that protect them, and poverty, combined with a lack of income diversity, often render workers more vulnerable to predatory or abusive working relationships. These all increase the risk of forced labor. In the cocoa sector, a lack of formal contracts for farmers and farm workers, as well as low awareness of labor laws and a weak capacity to enforce them in remote rural areas, further increase the risk of forced labor and allow abusive working relationships to go unchecked. What can be done to prevent forced labor? Being aware of and being able to identify indicators of forced labor is a crucial step in addressing the issue. Raising awareness about workers' rights can better prevent them from entering exploitative working arrangements. Making sure contracts are used and understood by all parties, including using graphical contracts or ensuring there are witnesses for verbal contracts, can avoid misunderstandings during recruitment. Regular visits from labor inspectors or community or supply chain monitors can ensure employers are informed about the law and comply with it. And addressing the underlying risk factors of forced labor, such as poverty and lack of education, can, in the long term, lower the risk to farmers and workers. What can be done to identify and address possible cases of forced labor? Effective and accessible grievance mechanisms can help workers report issues affecting themselves or their co-workers. For some cases of forced labor, mediation between the worker and the employer can help ensure workers are paid what is owed to them and stop exploitation or abuses. For other cases, or where issues cannot be rectified, referral to the appropriate law enforcement authorities may be necessary. Making sure victims get the appropriate care is also vital to support their physical and mental health. At ICI, we know that forced labor is a real, albeit localized risk that we need to be vigilant of. This is why we are working with our partners to prevent, identify, and address the risk of forced labor in the cocoa supply chain.